All right, welcome everyone to the beautiful Rainy Hall. I see quite a few people who are not at New College. Let me introduce myself. My name is Shadab Rahmatullah. I am a Muslim liberation theologian, and I teach Islamic studies and Christian-Muslim relations here at the School of Divinity. I am also the director of Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion. The School of Divinity and New College Pride is delighted to host the Reverend Jarel Robinson-Brown, who has come all the way from London. And he will be speaking on the intersectionality of race, sexuality, and faith leadership. A couple of housekeeping points. I don't mean to sound like a cheesy trailer at a cinema house, but if your phone is not on silent, please put it on silent as we are recording this lecture for those who aren't able to come today. Fire exit. If there's a fire, stand up and run. If there's a fire, calmly stand up, leave the door to your left, and Colin will be waiting at the top of the stairwell to direct you to the exits. If you need to use the toilets, you can just go out from the door to your left, down the stairwell, and the toilets are to your right. Before introducing our esteemed guest, let me ask Emma Maven from NC Pride to come up and say a few words. Emma is the head of New College Pride. She is originally from Newcastle, and Emma is the ultimate die-hard New College student. She's done all her degrees here, her undergraduate, her Master of Theology, and she's currently completing a PhD in the history of Christianity. And her doctoral thesis is exploring the suffering in the mystical theology of John of the Cross. Please join me in welcoming Emma.
Thank you. Excuse me. New College Pride is the School of Divinity's group for LGBTQ+ students, staff, and allies. Its focus is on strengthening the welcoming and inclusive culture within New College and on supporting LGBTQ+ members of the school and their allies. It draws inspiration from a renowned queer theologian, the late Marcella Althaus-Reid, whose picture is just up there, and who was Professor of Contextual Theology here at New College. As part of that, the group has organised events which place sexuality at the centre of theological discussion. These have included a one-day conference on Christianity and LGBT, which explored the relationship between various aspects of Christianity and LGBT people of faith, and a talk by the theologian Lisa Isherwood on the history and future of queer theology. Today's talk is another NC Pride event, and future events, which are likely to involve a speaker followed by time to socialise, are being planned, as is something to mark Edinburgh Pride, which is on the 25th of June. For those Divinity students and staff who are here today, if there are issues you see here in the school which should be addressed, if you have suggestions for how NC Pride or the school more generally could support LGBT students and staff, we will always be glad to hear from you. The group has an email address, which is ncpride@ed.ac.uk. Please do get in touch. And we also have an occasional newsletter, which you can ask to receive. The importance of the inclusion of minority and often marginalised groups within educational and social settings is something which our group, and of course many people outside it, feel passionate about. We hope always to be open to new ideas on how best to support LGBTQ+ students and staff at New College, and to be open to challenges to our ways of thinking, especially where those involve issues of intersectionality. On that note, we are honoured and delighted to have the Reverend Jarel Robinson-Brown here today.
Thank you, Emma. Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. The Reverend Jarel Robinson-Brown is a theologian, a scholar, a writer, and a musician. Father Jarel is an Anglican priest and currently serves as assistant curate at St. Botolph's without Aldgate. Father Jarel is also a visiting scholar in contemporary spirituality at Sarum College and vice chair of the LGBT Christian charity One Body, One Faith. Prior to full-time ministry, he studied classical music as a pianist and organist. His lecture today is titled after his recent book, Black, Gay, British, Christian, Queer, The Church and the Famine of Grace, which was published by SEM Press in 2021. Please join me in welcoming Father Jarel Robinson-Brown to New College.
Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you to Dr. Shadab and to the School of Divinity for the invitation, and to Emma. It's lovely to be able to be here and to see you all, and to be able to do this in person, because that's my preferred way of operating, so that's wonderful. I was asked by Dr. Shadab to give not really a lecture in the kind of normal academic sense, which after a week of being at a theological conference called SST at Warwick Uni, I'm much relieved to be able to come here and speak in a more relaxed way. But what Dr. Shadab asked for was a more personal reflection rather than an academic lecture, so it will feel like that, and I hope that that's helpful. And as it's being recorded, I will do my best to not be too honest or to do anything like swearing until we get to the Q&A. I'll be on my best behavior as much as possible. The first thing I should say is that at the center of all of my theology and all of my work as a priest and as a scholar, at the center is my conviction that God took on human flesh in the person of Jesus Christ, and therefore human nature, and that act of God becoming human is what makes me not a liberal theologian, but a liberation theologian. And at the heart of everything I do, and everything I write, and everything I say, is that kind of key theological idea within Christianity, what we would call the incarnation, that God becomes human in the person of Christ. And in the book, I think that comes across quite a lot, really, that my understanding of grace, my understanding of the world, my understanding of God kind of begins and ends, not with the crucifixion or the resurrection, but with Christ being born as a baby and as someone who is vulnerable and homeless and stateless in Bethlehem. And so that's really important for understanding where I'm coming from and how I understand God. Now, hopefully this works. There we go. This quote, "The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story." That quote by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And I wanted to start with that because I wanted to say to you, I don't know what you see when you look at me, but in other spaces, just looking like this can represent not only what other people imagine in their minds, but what have been put on to people who look like this throughout the ages. So when you see me, there are things that other people see, some of which are true and some of which are not. People see this uniform and they assume things like holiness, heterosexuality, celibacy, wisdom, power, pedophilia, Roman Catholicism. And those things are things which people immediately sometimes relate to this uniform. And yet beneath that, every priest, whoever she or he or they may be, is simply a human being. What you won't see is that I'm tattooed, I have a non-visible disability. You might not know from looking at me that I'm someone who knows what it means to go hungry, to not have food, to lose one's home. So there are a number of those things which, when we see someone, we just assume, and we're all guilty of it, I think, in one way or the other, because we want a single story to kind of captivate the people that we see. And even I, as I look out at you now, I'm already doing that, because it's what we do as human beings. But a number of those things are transgressed and subverted. They're turned upside down when this same body wears different clothes. So on my day off, when I'm walking my dog in the East End of London, in trainers and tracksuit bottoms and a hoodie, actually what people see is very different. The last thing they might assume is that I'm gay. They might not assume that I'm a priest. They'd be very surprised probably by those two things coming together. And so actually, the problem with the single story is that the single story stuff begins with what we see, and we're all guilty of it in different ways. They're putting people into boxes in order to make sense of them for ourselves, to make other people intelligible to us, to our own categories of being. And the problem with categories of being is that actually they don't work really for any of us all of the time. But the other problem with categories of being is that not only do other people put us in them, but we also put ourselves into the frame of the single story. Now, the boy in that picture was someone who was in love with the church, definitely thought he would grow up to marry a woman, and had no sense that his Jamaican culture, a bit like his church culture, would one day reject him, or at least one part of him. And when I look back at this picture, I'm often amazed by it. I only found it again the other day, after Desmond Tutu had died, and I always wanted to meet him in my life. And it suddenly kind of dawned on me that I had wanted to do this thing for quite a long time, and was serious about it really early on. And there in Madame Tussauds, I wanted to take a picture with Desmond Tutu, not knowing that I would grow up to be a priest like he was. But there's something also about the kind of world I imagined I would inhabit and live in, one which actually hasn't been true, and the kind of person that I thought I was. And we all have this experience of kind of growing up and realizing things about ourselves and our world. But there's something very powerful, I think, about me looking back at that picture and realizing what it means now to know the feeling of being exiled in the one place where one thought one would belong, right? In the church, in the black community, within one's own family or friendship group. Something that Toni Morrison said in her essay, The Sight of Memory, is that like Frederick Douglass talking about his grandmother, and James Baldwin talking about his father, and Simone de Beauvoir talking about her mother, my ancestors are my access to me. They are my entrance to my own interior life. And I found that to ring true for me as well, that actually I can't be understood by myself. I wanted to share these pictures with you because I wasn't raised by either of my parents. I was raised by my grandmother. My sister and I were both raised by our grandmother from the age of 5 for me, and a bit later for my sister. My grandmother was born in 1930 in Cuba to Jamaican and Cuban parents. She had a Jamaican mother and a Cuban father. Her mother returned to Jamaica, where she grew up in St. Thomas, a suburban parish in the southeastern end of Jamaica, in the parish of St. Thomas, which is in the county of Surrey. My nan was orphaned at 5. She had just one memory of seeing her mum being taken away by medical doctors, and then after that, the last time she saw her again was at her funeral, and her father was just not around at all. But she was adopted by a school teacher who was teaching in Jamaica from America, and who took her under her wings and brought her up. And I tell you that story because it's a way of understanding also how I understand God. Because my nan did for me what was done for her. She did for me and my sister what she had experienced, a sense of, again, finding oneself exiled in the one place that one ought to belong. She had other family members in Jamaica who didn't take her in. Her school teacher took her in. She was treated like a servant by her own family, basically. And she went on to recreate the act of love. So keep that image in your head, because for me, it's how I understand God's grace and God's love through the love, the care, the nurture that I experienced in my grandmother. But I also take you here for another reason, because I think it's hard to understand who I am and how I approach the world in which I live without realizing something else about how I see things. One thing my grandmother always used to say to me growing up was, son, is what she used to call me, you and I are coming from afar, she would say again and again. And I would look at this old woman and be like, what do you mean? You know, I was born here in London, you're the one that's come from afar, what are you talking about? And it wasn't until I got much older that I began to realize what she meant. She meant that we were the living legacy of 600,000 enslaved people who were taken to Jamaica out of 20 million forcefully enslaved people taken from West Africa. She meant that we were coming from afar and that our story was much longer, much more complicated than the West London area in which I grew up and which I knew, that actually I had a long lineage that I needed to know about. And as I got older, I began to realize what she meant and how powerful the words of the psalmist in Psalm 137 verse 4 is. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And I wasn't in a strange land at that time, but I began to find myself in one. And slowly I began to realize even more that there was something very specific about where my family in Jamaica came out of. So from St. Thomas, which is in Morant Bay, the site of the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865. Paul Bogle, a Baptist minister, rebelled with a group of other Jamaican people who were enslaved against the people that were enslaving them. And 439 Jamaicans were killed in response to this uprising, and 15 people were hanged, including Paul Bogle, in response to this revolution that they began in that part of Jamaica. And I have that rebellious spirit in me, and I can understand it when I look back and think about my nan's words. And I tell you that really to tell you that the black radical side of me comes from that, I think. From understanding that actually oppression isn't something that just disappears, that actually people don't just give you freedom and equality, that you don't just get justice in this world, that systems have to be troubled, challenged, abolished, taken away. And it's from my understanding of what it means to be someone of Jamaican heritage. James Baldwin is someone that I would quote constantly, if I could. I'm going to quote him more than once today because he's someone that I really value and someone who helps me make sense of my place in the world. He says that we all exist, after all, and crucially, in the eye of the beholder. We all react to, and to whatever extent become, what the eye sees. This judgment begins in the eyes of one's parents, the crucial, the definitive, the all but everlasting judgment. And so we move in the vast and claustrophobic gallery of others, on, up, or down the line, to the eye of one's enemy, or one's friend, or one's lover. Now think about what I said at the beginning, how do you see me? One of the things I began to realize really early on is that I had to make a choice. I could either live according to the expectations of people, so I could either live according to what black communities thought I ought to be, what Jamaican culture kind of put upon me, the heteronormativity, all of that, toxic masculinity, patriarchy, we can go on and on. Internalized homophobia, I could act in all of those ways. And also the way in which people want clergy to behave, right? I could pretend that I'm someone I'm not because I'm in this uniform. And that's a really easy thing to fall into because actually people have expectations of what they want a priest to be. And to push back on that and remind people of how human I am is actually quite challenging, but for me is the only way I know how to resist the gaze that James Baldwin's talking about, that eventually changes you to behave in a way that makes other people happy, but which is deeply untrue. And we all know it because we all wear masks, not the ones we're wearing at the moment, but actual other masks to please people, right? Because they make other people comfortable. We live within those categories of being which actually are not true or helpful to us, within which we can't breathe, but which actually we end up finding ourselves living in. And Emily Towns, a black womanist scholar in America, says, she talks about this as being stranded in the castles of our skin. And I love that language because I know that feeling. But to break out of that is a real challenge. And I can still remember, I think, when I decided that the only gaze that I cared about, the only beholder I wanted to pay attention to and to please was God's. That actually I didn't really care about other people's gaze and how they saw me. And that sometimes meant that you lost communities of belonging, that you lost family members, that you lost friendship groups, that the church treated you in a certain way, that you were going to have to navigate the world with a certain amount of armory to navigate the world in a safe way. But that was the only way I knew how to breathe and live in this body. And it was a decision that I made. One of the things that one of my favorite poets, Ocean Vuong, talks about, he's a gay Vietnamese-American poet and writer. He says, quite beautifully, I think, being queer saved my life. Often we see queerness as deprivation, but when I look at my life, I saw that queerness demanded an alternative innovation for me. I had to make alternative routes. It made me curious. It made me ask, is this enough for me? And I really relate to that because I think I came to the church and I came to theology and I came to life, I think, and I asked that same question, is this enough for me, can I actually live with this? Is the theology enough? Is the spirituality enough? Is the church as it is enough? And so what do you do when you're in that place? How do you change the theology into which you're born and in which you find yourself? What do you do? How do you innovate in a religion that has such an ancient tradition? But I want to ask you, how many openly LGBTQ+ black priests are in the UK? Anyone want to be bold? Yes? 3? I wish. Anyone else? 1. Not quite that bad. Let's see if this works. There's 2 of us. This is me and my dear friend, Father Jide Macaulay. He's also an Anglican priest. We're the 2. Now, we know lots of other black LGBTQ priests, but none of them are as open or particularly public about their sexuality. They would certainly not want to be identified by us by name. They wouldn't join us at a thing like this. We know quite a few, but the only 2 are us, both Anglican priests. I'm in the Diocese of London and Jide is in the Diocese of Chelmsford. Both British born, although Jide is Nigerian and grew up in Nigeria but was born in London. He had a background as a lawyer. And we often at events kind of just laugh because it's always us and it's us again. You know, where are the others? And we name them to each other, but they don't turn up. And I say this to kind of make a point that when it came to innovation for me, I actually didn't have anyone to look to know what that looked like, right? I trained alongside a lot of people who were training to be priests, who were LGBTQ+, but who were white, and had models in terms of even the people that were teaching us in Cambridge as we were training to be priests. And Jide and I actually trained in Cambridge at the same time. And funny story if there's time. But when I first met Jide, I didn't get on with him at all. I actually couldn't stand him, and he knows this, because it was too much. I couldn't cope with someone who was so comfortable in their own skin that I actually avoided him. And it wasn't until we both left Cambridge that we became really close friends, because when I met him the first time, I was like, can't do this, like, please. And you know, if I hang around with you, other people are going to know that I'm black and gay as well, and I just can't have that because I want to make it out alive, and there's enough to stop you from being able to thrive in a place like Cambridge. Now, the context in the States is very different. Obviously, it's a larger country, but both historically and present day, these are some of the most prominent black LGBTQ+ clergy in the States. So Emily Towns, who I believe is a Baptist minister and womanist scholar, Marcus Halley, Father Marcus at the bottom, there's Father Broderick Greer, this is Pauline Murray, which I hope many of you know about. If you don't, you must Google her, or them. We don't know much about Paulie in terms of how she would like, or they would like to be identified. Paulie kind of sits at the intersections of many things, and is someone who really should be studied because Paulie is incredible. Winnie Varghese, a great friend of mine, also in the States, and Father Brian Massingale, who's a big deal because he's a Roman Catholic priest and is openly gay and black. That takes courage, a particular kind of courage, but also one of the interesting things is how many of these people, in order to survive, have to take refuge, basically, in academia. And actually, if they wanted to serve in parishes, that wouldn't necessarily be the easiest thing to do, particularly Father Brian. So he's basically in scholarship and kind of has to stay there, in essence, to function as a priest. And there's also Bishop Dion Johnson, who is a openly gay married bishop in the Episcopal Church. He's the Bishop of Missouri, I believe, who's not on here, and is actually of Bayesian heritage, so he was born in Barbados. And I wanted to show you that just to say that I think had I been in the States, I would have understood my own innovation process differently. But here in Britain, there was just no one who was doing the work in the same way. So James Baldwin again. He writes, or he said this at the Cambridge Union in 1965. It comes as a great shock, around the age of 5, 6, or 7, to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to see Gary Cooper killing off the Indians, and although you are rooting for Gary Cooper, to realize that the Indians are you. Now, I love that quote because, and it took me a while to realize it, but what Jimmy's kind of pointing to in relation to the American flag is precisely the kind of process I had when it comes to the church. That I thought the church had pledged an allegiance to me, that it was a place in which I belonged. I had always understood that I was amongst the saved and, one of the people that was included in God's grace, right? One of the people Jesus came to love and look after, who was included in his community of embrace and inclusion, only to grow up to discover the very opposite. And also to discover that about Jamaican culture in a way, and also British culture in another. Right? And this is where the intersectionality thing is really important. Because where you might find belonging in one particular community, in another, you find exclusion. So there's times in the LGBT community where you experience racism, times within the Jamaican culture that I experience homophobia, times within the Christian community that I experience both racism and homophobia, in the church, ageism as well. So there's no place that really feels as if it's pledge allegiance in any way, shape or form. But that's an interesting place to be. So moving on with the innovation idea, I had to find a way of developing a theology that could include someone like me. And so where did I look? To the States, because there was nothing I could see here. And these were all the books that I read, and books which feature quite a lot in my own work. The first book, which is by Pamela Lightsey, who wrote the foreword to my book, Our Lives Matter, is an amazing book, a really great kind of accessible book, thinking through a womanist queer theology. Enfleshing Freedom by M. Sean Copeland, who's a Roman Catholic. She was a nun. She's a theologian in the States. Talks a lot about the sacrament of Holy Communion and the sacrament of baptism and how those relate to sexuality, to race, to desire. Horace Griffin, who's an openly gay Anglican priest in the States, wrote a really brilliant book, Their Own Receive Them Not, on what it's like to be lesbian and gay within the black church in the States, which is a particular experience. And then someone who is an ally of the LGBT community, Kelly Brown Douglas, wrote this amazing book, Sexuality in the Black Church, a womanist perspective. And this book is incredible. And it really shows why it is that homophobia sometimes in the black churches can be such a problem, and what that fear of the other is rooted in, and sometimes where people are kind of acting out of. So a really good book. All great books, right? But not my context. Like, fantastic. But the history of race and the history of sexuality and the history of the church in the States is so different to the UK context. We have no James Baldwins, we have no Martin Luther Kings, we have no, Paulie Murray's, the same kind of history in which to start our innovation from. So it felt like I was starting from scratch, even though there was a lot of people who had gone before me in many ways, and I write about them in the book from the British context. But there was nothing doing this from within the UK context, looking at what it meant to be black and queer in the British church. So when I got to the task of writing, I tried to just make sure that I kept four things at the forefront of my mind. Having to kind of deconstruct my theology and not just look to the US for help was a challenge. I longed to help others navigate the kind of shark-infested waters that I had to navigate on my own. So in many ways, what I wanted to do very basically was kind of provide a buffer between the what I call ecclesial terrorism in the church and theological violence and the people that's aimed at. So a lot of the black LGBTQ people that I know who knew or thought they knew what scripture had to say about them or what the church had to say about them and had nothing between them and the homophobia that perhaps came from their family or their friendship groups or their cultural communities. I wanted to just put something in between and say, actually, this might not help everyone, but hopefully it helps some. I wanted to offer a theology of grace which was not rooted in transformation of the believer. Let's see if that stops. But which was able to be more capacious and actually to include all people regardless of their backgrounds and of the kind of bodies that they had in their experiences. So often grace is seen as something which has to change us. And that's a big issue, and I could go on for that for a long time. We don't have time today. But I wanted to talk about grace as something which is just poured out on people, which actually doesn't mean that we have to change and become different people in order to be loved by God. I wanted to decouple grace from sin, because often people talk about grace as though we can only talk about grace through the lens of sin, and that's deeply problematic when you're talking to communities that are so used to the language of sin being applied to them, right? So women, black people, trans folk, the LGBT community, single parents, whoever doesn't fit into the neat categories that the church loves. We're used to talking about those people through the lens of sin. And I wanted to decouple grace from mercy, because I think it's very different. And actually, mercy always implies that someone has done something wrong and is therefore being shown a kindness. Grace isn't that. Grace is love, regardless of what you've done or haven't done, whether you get it or don't get it, whether you're sorry or not sorry. Grace is for you. It's different to mercy. And I wanted to make imaginations more capacious in dealing with the church's homophobia, racism, and transphobia. So what do we do in a racist, homophobic, transphobic church? Now, I didn't know I'd be quoting Marcella under her image, and I'm so honoured to do that, very humbled and scared. But something that Marcella says in her amazing book, Indecent Theology, is all the concepts of sin and grace seem to be unendingly tangled around the theologian's gaze at other people's beds, bathrooms, or sofas. God cannot be queered unless theologians have the courage to come out of their homosexual, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, transvestite, or ideal heterosexual closets. And I found in that a real challenge to me. Marcella's work was deeply challenging to me the first time I encountered it, because what I got from her work was the reality that I had to be braver, and I had to be more honest. This doesn't help with honesty, because the church often doesn't want us to be as honest as some of us would want to be. And I found that as a problem in the book, right? Knowing that I was committing things to paper, wanting to make sure that I'm not misunderstood, and that actually I have to live with whatever I say. I don't have the same freedom of those clergy who have entered academia, because actually, your paycheck's coming from somewhere else. I'm fed and housed by the church. That can stop whenever it's stopped. It's a fine line, it's a different kind of category. And it troubles academic freedom. I have to name that. So there are some places where I wanted to be braver, more honest, more courageous, and at times found myself not able to go there. So that's naming my own kind of cowardice at times. And I think this is so true, that so much of sin and grace has its focus in the wrong place. And so saying things to the church, the book is called, as it's subtitled, The Church and the Famine of Grace. One of the things I'm saying to the church is that I'm not saying you need to change. I'm saying you haven't changed, and therefore I'm not sure what we do with you. Right? That actually I don't think the church can be reformed. And it's a really hard thing to say as a priest, and you can ask me more about that in the Q&A, to be part of an institution that you fundamentally not just disagree with, but want to see fall apart in a way, so that what is actually the church can be born. And this is one of the things that I love about Bell Hooks' work, because she says, I love my family even as I critique their dysfunctionalities, right? And one of the things people often mistake about folk like me is that we hate the church because of what we're saying about it. But actually, if you love something and if you love people, you tell them the truth, no matter how hard that truth might be. I love the church. I want it to be better. I just haven't seen the evidence for that yet. Right? And I also realize that I am part of the problem because I'm upholding an institution that stops people breathing in all sorts of ways. And I don't think, and this is something that often colleagues who are LGBTQ+ in the ministry disagree with me on, but I don't think any of us can remove ourselves from being complicit in the church's violence. Right? Just because I'm naming stuff and I'm trying to do the work for justice and inclusion and equality doesn't mean that my hands are clean. And it's partly what I represent just by doing this job and by wearing these clothes and by being part of an organisation and an institution that is inherently problematic. And I don't know what to do with that. I'm just naming it because I think that's the truth. I have no solution. Every day I wake up and I decide to stay in it. The day may come when I don't. But for now, this is what obedience to the will of God looks like for me, right? And I'm just aware that that's not straightforward. James Baldwin again, last time I promise. You have to read all of his work, because I feel as though James, when I look at someone who is honest and models the kind of honesty I would love to have, it's him. To be black and gay when he was, and to name that, to do so courageously, for me is just very humbling, and I wish that I could have done that. I don't think I could have, but he did. And I think he gets the problems with the church in such a profound way. He says in one of his talks which he gave, he was invited to address the World Council of Churches in Uppsala, which was a big deal. I think Martin Luther King had just been assassinated, and they were meeting basically to talk about the church's response to racism, and they invited this black gay writer. So it was quite a big deal, and of course he ran with the opportunity to tell them the truth. You should read this essay, because it's very powerful. I think there's a recording of it online. He says that part of the dilemma of the Christian church is the fact that it opted, in fact, for power and betrayed its own first principles, which were a responsibility to every living soul. The nature of the lies the Christian church has always helplessly told about me are only a reflection of the lies the Christian church has always helplessly told itself, to itself, about itself. And I find that so powerful because I think he's really on the money, that the church has kind of set up a delusional idea and image of itself, which is not true. It's tried to distance itself from the violence and the harm and the trouble it's caused and is causing in the world, and likes to talk a lot about, evil and the devil and the spiritual dynamics of that, but doesn't like to claim responsibility. And if you want to see that being lived out right now, look at Ukraine and Russia and Patriarch Kirill, right? This is nothing to do with the church, but it's a spiritual evil. Let's name the truth, right? So we're seeing it again. We saw it in World War II. We saw it in the church's involvement with the slave trade. They had to find a reason for going to these uncivilized people in order to take the gospel to them, as though Africa was, some kind of tabula rasa that had never known Christianity or ever known God. And James Cone, an American theologian who was the first to really create a kind of black theology that was systematic and very, very powerful, asked some questions that I ask in my book. He asked the question, when does the church cease to be the church of Jesus Christ? When do the church's actions deny the faith that it verbalizes? And then he goes on to ask, what actions deny the truth disclosed in Jesus Christ? Where should the line be drawn? Can the Church of Jesus Christ be racist and Christian at the same time? Can the Church of Jesus Christ be politically, socially, and economically identified with the structures of oppression and also be a servant of Christ? Can the Church of Jesus Christ fail to make the liberation of the poor the center of its message and work and still remain faithful to its Lord? In other words, James Cone gives the church a kind of ultimatum, right? Choose who you want to be in the world, because you can't do both. And I take his questions and I ask another one. I ask, can the church neglect the primacy of grace in its dealings with and relations to God's LGBTQ+ children and still be the church? Andrew Prevost, at a paper he gave at the Society for the Study of Theology, said that God, race, and sexuality are abyssal mysteries. Their histories are full of cruelty and bloodshed. Yet I believe that there is more to the mysteries of God, race, and sexuality than the destructive nothingness of evil that they so tragically bear. There is also a genuine opportunity to receive grace. I think that one of the things people often expect when they hear folk like me speak is that all that I have to talk about is suffering and pain. And one thing that Edward Glissant said is that we have to take on the consent not to be a single being. And that's to come full circle, really, and to go back to where we started. Because there is something about this life and this experience and this existence which is deeply joyful, deeply mysterious, deeply beautiful. And I'm kind of grateful that I haven't had a life that has made thinking and believing simple for me, that I've had to innovate, I've had to create, I've had to push back on the categories of being that folk have so often wanted to put me into. Because actually what you find in those places is God. You find God in the margins, you find God in the places where people are oppressed, excluded, where people are ignored and sidelined. And so I just wanted to end really with this last image, which for me is an image of the church at its best. It's an image of what the church can be, a church which puts its body where Christ put his, between the forces of evil and God's people, between the brutality of the world, the violence of the empire. A Jesus that somehow stands with the least, the last, and the lost. And these nuns at Selma, putting themselves between the police and the opposition and black folk, is for me a model of the kind of Christianity that makes sense for me. Christianity that at its beginning and its end is all about liberation, because that is why Christ came, to give us life in all its fullness. That's the only way that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ makes sense. And when we think of that, actually we begin to realize what Christianity needs to be in the life of the world, not just now, but the life of the world to come. So thank you.